What evil lurks in the hearts of men? The Shadow knows.
This is the Shadow.
My hypnotic power has clouded your mind.
The Shadow!
Yes, the Shadow.
I'll be there in every empty room, as inevitable as your guilty conscience.
Because her name is Justice. Her revenge for your mockery will be death.
Agents of the Shadowcast and Pulpiteers the world over, report! For we return for the only podcast on the internet exclusively devoted to the immortal exploits of the Dark Avenger of the Pulps, the comics, the film serials, and of course, the golden days of radio, The Shadow. Today, we're going to have a lot of fun. So we already covered the James Patterson Shadow novel that, to be blunt, was not remotely in line with the legacy or worthy of the legacy of this incredible character. So what I wanted to do today was a bit of a palate cleanser. We're coming back a little bit earlier than normal because it is time for us to just cleanse the mental palate, dive in feet first, and I think really what we need to do is just realize how much better the actual original text that Walter Gibson created. I mean, you've got over 300 Shadow novels, and that's just in the classic period. There were even more written after that, and God willing, someone with actual talent and actual deference for the source material will come along and actually write some proper modern pulps in the way that Philip Jose Farmer did for Doc Savage and others. So hopefully that happens at some point, but I'm not holding my breath after this James Patterson fiasco. Look, Condé Nast only have the rights to the character for another 7 years or something, but who knows what'll happen there. So either way, I think we'll be seeing some movement on this character on the literary front in one way or another. But for now, I think the way to go is to really head back to the original source text and to really look at some of those classic Walter B. Gibson Shadow novels. We are, of course, exploring in the second season of the Shadowcast, entitled The Pulp Avenger. And as the nomenclature suggests, folks, we are going through basically the first year and change of the Shadow's pulp exploits. We're reviewing one pulp novel per episode, and today we have a doozy, widely acknowledged as one of the better Shadow stories in the earlier years, really in any of the years of the Shadow's publication history, The Death Tower. I really enjoyed this one. It's a bit on the episodic side, but it also lays a lot of groundwork. So folks, first off, we have a lot of firsts here. We've been talking about this in every single episode. There's been some kind of first. So in the last episode where we were talking about, 2 episodes back, we were reviewing Gangnam's Doom for the 90th anniversary of The Shadow. And in that episode, without getting into spoilers, one of the Shadow's trusted agents, who will not identify if you haven't read it yet, falls in the line of duty, and it's the only time that this ever occurs in the Shadow's publication history, for good or ill. And it's a it's a shot across the bow for the Shadow. It essentially turns Gangnam's Doom into one of the first true revenge tales in the history of this character, which I find kind of interesting. Usually he's a little bit more circumspect. There's either global events going on. There's some kind of higher stakes. It's either a crime wave or a serial killer or a gang lord, right? That's what we've been dealing with up until now. And here in Gangnam's Doom, suddenly it's a little bit more personal. There's actually one of his agents, and while I won't say Walter Gibson really explores the emotional impact of that, it's clear that the Shadow is operating largely from a position of squaring the scales, really. You messed with one of my agents, okay, you're going to pay. There's an element of that, even though it isn't quite explicated in quite the way you might expect it. I think a modern writer probably would have the Shadow sob and paint his fingernails and shave his legs and cry about how one of his agents died. But, fortunately, Walter Gibson doesn't quite get that crass, but I do feel like there could have been a middle ground there where we could have had a little bit, had it affect him just a hair more. But that is not what happens. The Death Tower is an interesting experiment in a number of ways. First off, it is probably outside of the original trilogy. As I've said before, The Living Shadow, Eyes of the Shadow, and The Shadow Laughs essentially form a continuity trilogy. There are returning characters, a returning villain even, and this is the first time outside of that. We had the Red Menace, we had Gangnam's Doom, and now with the Death Tower and the pulp novelette that will follow it by the name of The Silent Seven, we are introducing really a duology here. This is a two-parter for all intents and purposes, because strange inversion in a few ways. So not only are you adding this sort of duology aspect, but your main villain, whereas previous villains now for a little while have been sort of concealing their identity or sometimes simply concealing their culpability. In the case of the Red Menace, the Red Envoy had to be sussed out, right? He had to be discovered. And that's something that's actually going to become a recurrent element in future stories such as The Black Master and Double Z and some of the other more murder mystery type of stories. But here, the story just comes right out and shows you who the villain is, exactly what he's doing, and it's a fairly brilliant plot. So the main antagonist of this particular story is Dr. Palermo. And I don't know that there are many Shadow villains who are quite as ghoulish as this guy. I mean, we open up with him killing a man. I mean, fair enough, Shadow villains often kill people, and actually, if you want to get technical about it, he really doesn't. In the first instance of what really is probably the primary gimmick of the Death Tower, first off, it's not really technically a tower. It's a 40-story apartment building. I guess a tower by 1930s standards. But it's essentially a giant death trap. It's full of, walls that move away and floors that fall away. And this passage, which opens up the book, really, this is a classic case of Walter Gibson baiting the hook fantastically. He starts off with this insidious act. Horace Chatham obeyed. He lay back in the chair and reclined his head so that it nearly rested against the oak paneling of the wall. He watched Palermo deftly remove the purple sapphire from its case. "A beautiful gem," observed the physician. "Strange that those who hold it should fear it. I would not dread its curse if it were mine." The words soothed Chatham. He half smiled as he looked at the gem which Dr. Palermo held. So intent was his mind on it that he was utterly oblivious to all else. The panel behind Horace Chatham's head slid noiselessly to one side. The action followed a motion by Dr. Palermo, a simple gesture in which the physician raised the forefinger of his left hand. As the panel opened, two thick-set brown hands came into view, one on each side of Chatham's chair. "You will forget your fears, Chatham," came Palermo's dulcet voice. "In an instant they will vanish, and they will never return. I can promise you that." The physician spoke on, gazing intently at the gem in his hand, but Horace Chatham never heard the words that followed. For while Palermo talked, the brown hands slipped suddenly forward and, coming together, gripped Chatham's throat. A slight gurgle escaped Chatham's lips. He clutched and clawed at the strangling hands, but his efforts were without avail. The grim talons were victorious. The pressure never yielded while Chatham gasped away his life. When the man in the chair became motionless, the brown hands slipped back into the darkness, and the panel closed in the wall. Dr. Palermo was still speaking, and his voice was gloating. He was talking to a dead man in the chair. He stopped suddenly and looked at Chatham's body while he smiled. Then he turned away and opened the drawer of a table. Replacing the purple sapphire in its case, he tossed the gem and its carrier into the drawer. Now, if you're an ardent devotee of the Shadow, you may have caught the purple sapphire there. And yes, it is, of course, a bit of a reference to the purple urusol, which is it's an earlier short story, I believe, that Walter B. Gibson wrote, but was not able to shop to any actual pulp publishers. This is, I believe, before the Shadow magazine even started. So he actually wound up basically taking a lot of plot elements from that, and the whole idea of a purple gem. Technically, the Shadow's ring is a Mexican fire opal, but often it's described as changing to a purplish hue and so forth. He basically took that and put it in the Shadow, and here we're seeing another reference to it. Actually, incidentally, if you read that story, which has since been published, it's been reprinted a couple of times actually, in the Purple's Urusol, a lot of the plot wound up being reused and put into two stories. It was put into The Red Menace and also into a future story that we're going to talk about called Hands in the Dark. But the curse around this gem, this is a common kind of MacGuffin conceit with Walter B. Gibson. It's supposed to be cursed. His friend, Chatham's friend Harriman, had given it to him. He seemed panicked and gave it over to him just to basically to get rid of it. And then suddenly Harriman came back to Chatham and begged for it back. And when he refused to give the sapphire back, he explained that it was apparently cursed, and just whatever you do, if you're going to hold on to it, that's fine, but don't tell anyone you have it because it brings doom to everyone who comes near this sapphire. And then, just a few weeks later, Harriman apparently commits suicide by shooting himself in the head. So great setup already. You're adding some mystery here. Okay, is there a crime involved? Is this just something people want? Or is there actually an era of the supernatural? Common narrative elements in a lot of these Walter B. Gibson novels. The cohabitation of crime with the supposed quasi-supernatural is always this recurrent element, and usually, in fact, always, there's some kind of logical, real-world explanation. But you might be wondering, why are you saying Palermo is like one of the most evil guys? He just basically hired his manservant to kill a guy. What makes him so bad? Well, then he disguises himself as Chatham, and he goes to the home of Wilkinson, another wealthy man about town. And he's now, remember, he's fully disguised as Chatham. He makes sure that he's seen as Chatham by a bunch of witnesses. And he goes to the home of Wilkinson and he stabs him and murders him as Chatham. Still not bad enough for you, right? He's an impersonator. He's essentially set up a dead man to have performed a murder. And so by way of cover-up, the authorities now suspect that a man has committed it who hasn't and who, in fact, is dead. But it gets even better. Dr. Palermo, who is a psychiatrist, psychologist, whatever, actually takes Chatham's body down to his laboratory where he dissects the corpse and removes his brain in order to conduct all kinds of horrific medievalish kind of experiments on it. This guy is twisted, and this is actually pretty gruesome for Walter Gibson Shadow stuff. He didn't like to get too much into the blood, gore, and such, and it's not like it's described in any vivid detail here, but it's pretty grim stuff, actually. Basically, right off the bat, we've established Dr. Palermo is, he's a real jerk. He's not a pleasant guy. This story is also unique in that it includes not a one-off appearance, I suppose a two-off appearance by the Shadow's alter ego, apart from Lamont Cranston, yet another wealthy playboy, this time a wealthy playboy amateur criminologist by the name of George Clarendon. And he pops up in this story, and then I believe in possibly Hands in the Dark, just in kind of a little cameo capacity. He doesn't pop up a whole lot. But George Clarendon's a little interesting in that he's not that dissimilar from Lamont Cranston, although he's described as having this almost Cheshire grin constantly, which in my head as I'm reading just sounds deeply creepy. He's the one who engages Clyde Burke, who is now being basically the Shadow with one of his main agents having been gunned down by the Chicago mob. He's actually in the process of rebuilding his organization here, and you see a few agents, only one real recruitment, but it's suggested now that the Shadow is starting to build his organization through a number of means. So he recruits Clyde Burke, who's a journalist, of course. We're going to get to know him really, really well. He becomes one of the Shadow's principal agents. And he's hired to basically do work in a clipping service, and it actually winds up putting his life in a bit of danger ultimately. But this is, you can see he's sort of building his group of agents already. Then later in the story, one of the other debuts, along with Clyde Burke, is the debut of the Shadow's Auto Gyro. For those who don't know, because these really aren't seen much anymore, an Auto Gyro is really kind of a cross between a biplane and an early form of helicopter. And it's odd because in some ways, they're at least reputed by people who understand aviation, they're reputed to be a bit more on the stable side compared to some models of helicopter, but slowly over time, the Auto Gyro just kind of fell out of favor and the design was gradually replaced by either standard airplanes or increasingly by flat-out modern helicopters. The presence of the Auto Gyro has always been somewhat fascinating to me because a lot of Batman fans are not aware it was yet another element that Batman swiped, that Bill Finger and Bob Kane swiped early on, before he had the Batwing, before he even had a Batplane. Batman had none other than a Bat Gyro. Very, very true. So nice little item of minutia. Add it to the list. What's fascinating here is that in the climactic scene of the novel, which I'll talk about a little bit later, without getting into too much detail, the Shadow can't possibly be piloting it in one particular scene. So somebody else has to be piloting it, but it isn't for another 3 years or so that the Shadow encounters his longtime pilot, Miles Crofton. So we're kind of left to guess who exactly is piloting the Auto Gyro in this instance. This isn't the first kind of instance of that. We already know from one of the previous stories that the Shadow has sort of a taxi cab driver who drives him around, but it's not Moshe Revnitz because he hasn't met Moshe Revnitz yet. That comes later. And sure enough, here in this instance, he doesn't know Miles Crofton yet, and yet somebody's flying his Auto Gyro. I think a lot of people have speculated that it might be Burbank, because Burbank shows up quite a bit in this story, and this is a period of time where Burbank has a rather ambiguous jack-of-all-trades kind of role. He's actually out in the field. In this instance, he's actually the elevator operator in the Death Tower, the Shadow trying to keep one of his agents on site to keep an eye on Dr. Palermo, which is ingenious. But, Burbank is actually out front. He's out in the field, and we saw that in the Red Menace as well. He was doing a little bit of tailing. He was actually more of a proactive agent. He wasn't just the communications guy. And in the next couple of stories, the same thing will be true. Burbank didn't have his truly defined role for quite some time. Probably not even really had it codified in the first 10 stories or so. And we're now, in story number 6 or something like that. So very interesting. This story is also somewhat unique in that it introduces a female villain, and she isn't necessarily punished at the end of it, but it's the interactions involving her. Her name is Thelda Blanchett, by the way. She's the girlfriend of Dr. Palermo, and it's kind of suggested that Dr. Palermo is sort of leading her on and manipulating her to do his bidding. She actually performs a murder on behalf of Dr. Palermo while he's keeping her cool in the friend zone. And then George Clarendon, or the Shadow as George Clarendon, comes in and actually works his male wiles on her. And this is a fascinating little sequence here because we get the Shadow getting his mac on a little bit. A man and a woman were finishing dinner in an alcove of the roof garden atop the Riviera Hotel. Palm trees secluded them from the main dining room. The soft, melodious music of the dance orchestra seemed very far away. A gentle breeze came through the arched opening on the other side. The girl looked out through the archway where the myriad lights of Manhattan glittered like jewels in the darkness. "Cigarette?" questioned the man. The girl nodded. The man watched his companion as she blew tiny puffs of smoke which took an orange hue from the mellow light of the alcove. She was very beautiful. Her eyes were half closed. Her long black lashes added to her natural charm. She seemed a modern Circe, an enchantress whose loveliness could lure a man into forgetfulness. The girl smiled as she glanced at her companion, but his face revealed nothing. His features were somewhat handsome, yet they seemed stern and mask-like. The girl slipped her hand across the table and gently pressed her companion's wrist. "George," she said softly, "life has seemed different since I met you. I've never forgotten that night at the Larchmoor. You left me, then you've never told me why, but since that night, I've thought of no one but you. We have been together often since then. Although it has been but a few days, it seems as though I have known you always." The phantom of a smile appeared on the man's thin lips. Either these two were governed by mutual sincerity, or they were actors par excellence, for neither betrayed any expression that would belie the words that they had spoken. Had Dr. Palermo been there to see them, he would have been disturbed, for it seemed as though Thelda Blanchette, in her efforts to win George Clarendon's confidence, had succumbed to the man's dynamic personality, and Clarendon seemed yielding to the charm and beauty of this exquisite girl. The two were playing a part in a grim game. Each knew the circumstances, although no mention had been made of them. While they were together, George Clarendon apparently controlled the only agent through whom Dr. Palermo could act. In like manner, Thelda Blanchette, while she accompanied George Clarendon, prevented action by Dr. Palermo's arch-enemy. It was a neutralizing of forces. While this condition existed, the death duel between Palermo and the Shadow was indefinitely postponed. Strangely, both participants in this passive drama seemed to have forgotten everything but each other. "I am willing to forget the past," said the man. The girls seemed to thrill at his words. "Yes, I am willing to forget the past. Later. At present, I have work to do. Then, Thelda, we shall be free." "No, George," exclaimed the girl. She met Clarendon's gaze with eyes that were filled with apprehension. "We must not wait. We cannot tell what may happen to prevent our love." "We must." "No." The girl became suddenly sentimental. "We love each other. We must act. Now." She placed her hands upon Clarendon's as she leaned across the narrow table. Clarendon, too, leaned forward. The girl's arms were upon his shoulders. Their lips met in a long kiss. The soft lights of the room, the distant melody of the orchestra, the gentle breeze from the archway, all were forgotten in the happiness of the moment. Really, really uncharacteristic, not just of the Shadow, the in-universe character, but of the Shadow magazine in general. It must be said, not a whole lot of time for the fairer sex in the Shadow magazine, which is interesting because on numerous occasions, the editor of the Shadow magazine and one of the most important formative figures for the pulp version of the Shadow, John Nanovic, was at a convention alongside Walter B. Gibson, talking to and being interviewed by Anthony Tollin, famous Shadow historian that he is. And it happened to come up in the course of that presentation and panel that John Nanovic said, actually, you know what? Our readership in the Shadow magazine was not quite as much of a sausage fest as you would think.
Unlike the misogynistic, anti-female audiences of the Pulp magazine. No, really? Okay.
No, that's all. There are no anti-female. We had not as many. I bet we had 1/3 of our readers were female. So where do the people get this crap? This is constantly.
Well, we had to have voice contrast.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I don't hear about that. I mean, in the magazines, we had not as many, but about 1/3 of our readers were girls or women.
Okay, I stand corrected.
And that was a good proportion.
But either way, this is a very atypical Shadow novel in a number of ways. Granted, we're pretty much in the incipient stages of the Shadow magazine, so we're still sort of sorting out exactly what it is, but it's very atypical in that way. Probably the best sequence by far is the very end, where it appears that Clyde Burke and Harry Vincent are about to be done away with some unnecessary exploratory surgery from Dr. Palermo, when suddenly a dark savior appears. Hassan brought a case of instruments. Dr. Palermo had discarded the guise of a mandarin for that of a surgeon. He made careful, methodical arrangements that Harry had never before witnessed. The preparations made Harry tremble. He could only stare in horrified fascination. The motor began to buzz. It purred with a steady rhythm that made the scene more terrible. "You're about to witness a most delicate operation," said Palermo in a cold, heartless tone. "It will be performed on the base of the brain. I shall proceed slowly. It will be several minutes, I hope, before the subject loses consciousness." The noise of the motor was maddening. To Harry's ears, it seemed to come from all parts of the room. His senses were rendered more acute, perhaps, by the terrible drama before him. He was not thinking of his own doom. He was overwhelmed by his desire to aid his friend. The clamps held Harry as he struggled to free himself from the restraining chair. Dr. Palermo was oblivious to everything except his intended work. Hassan seemed occupied in watching him. The image of Chong glared steadily, an outlandish figure in this room, which had been changed from an oriental chamber to an improvised laboratory. Palermo's right hand was steady as it held a long, thin knife. His left hand turned the head of Clyde Burke as though it were an inanimate object instead of a portion of a living human being. Clyde's eyes still held their helpless appeal. The point of the knife rested high on Clyde Burke's neck. The throbbing purr that had come to Harry's ears was dying. Still, the motor was whirling as before. It was a peculiar, unexplainable phenomenon. Palermo must have suddenly noticed it. He became motionless, standing in the attitude of the listener. A few seconds passed. Palermo inclined his head to proceed. An instant later, he looked up, an expression of profound astonishment upon his features. The French doors swung inward with a crash. Out of the black night appeared a tall figure clad in black. Its arms were spread, and the hanging folds of the cloak appeared like the wings of a huge, monstrous bat. Bright eyes glittered beneath the encircling hat brim. They were eyes that glowed with unsuppressed rage. Like some great flying mammal, this being had come from the inky heavens to wreak vengeance upon the white-clad criminal who stood with knife in hand. The Shadow, master of the darkness, had arrived just in time to stay the hand of the murderer. So as you may have guessed there, the climactic scene involves the Shadow actually dropping onto the roof of this high tower. There's this sort of high, as I understand it, the way the building is set up is it's a 40-story tower, but at the very tippy top, there's like an extra tower on top of that, and this is sort of the sanctum sanctorum of Dr. Palermo. And so the Shadow actually had his nameless autogyro pilot land right on the tippy top of that tower just to kick in the French doors and save his agents from essentially an unnecessary lobotomy. You may have caught the little bit about Chong, the so-called monstrous figure, in that bit of the story. I've always wondered, every time I've read this, I've wondered if the 1994 Shadow film with the sort of animated golden dagger might have been somewhat inspired by this character of Chong in the Death Tower. Basically, the idea is that there's this statue of this sort of pot-bellied, squat, like Chinese golden midget, sort of like a little Buddhist figure that glowers and crouches in the corner of the room. And when there's actually somebody that Palermo wants to have killed, or it's like an anti-theft system too. I think if there's an intruder there, Chong will show up and just murder them. He's supernaturally strong. It's essentially a statue that comes to life. And I won't spoil exactly what's really going on there, but it's a fascinating little bit of, again, like I was alluding to at the beginning of this episode, it's the appearance of the supernatural with a legitimate explanation generally tacked on. So a lot of fun. Almost reminds me of like Odd Job, a very Bond villain-ish, or like Knick Knack from The Man with the Golden Gun somewhat. But probably the most important element that's introduced in this novel actually has nothing to do with the climax. It happens a little bit earlier in like chapter 13, where Dr. Palermo is talking to the ace detective Warwick, who's sort of a rising star in the New York Police Department, as I understand it. And he's being quizzed by Dr. Palermo, and then it comes out that their allegiances are not so different. "Do you intend to answer me?" quizzed Warwick. Dr. Palermo pursed his lips. He seemed about to speak. While Warwick waited, the physician made a slow and deliberate reply that brought a gasp of amazement from the detective. For Palermo did not speak in words. He spoke in letters. N-O, he said. "Y-E-S, replied Warwick, staring as a man in a daze. "No, yes," said Palermo quietly, pronouncing the letters as if they were one word. "Say on," was Warwick's peculiar response. Palermo pressed his hands to his chest. One hand was spread, the other showed 2 fingers. "The Silent Seven," hissed Palermo. Automatically, the detective put his hands to the lapels of his coat. One hand was spread, the other formed a fist. "The Faithful 50, said Warwick in a voice filled with awe. From his vest pocket, Palermo removed 3 coins, a 5-cent piece and 2 coppers. Rising, he delivered them to Warwick. The detective stared at the coins. All 3 bore the date, 1915. The detective fumbled in his pocket and brought out a 50-cent piece, which he gave to the physician. Its date corresponded to those on the other coins. "Warwick," said Palermo, drawing his chair close to the detective, "you know the mission of the Silent Seven. They are known only to themselves." His voice became low and impressive. "And their followers must obey them without question." Stanley Warwick nodded. "Like the others," continued Palermo, "you have gained your present position through the influence of some member. We are men of power, seeking more power. Here in New York, you have been useful to us, but never did we demand your services except in cases of extreme urgency. That is why our power has become great, and our secrecy has been preserved, because we have not abused our privilege. How often have you worked for us?" "Only twice," replied Warwick. "Both times concerned matters of tremendous consequences, did they not?" "They did." "Then be prepared. This time a great task lies before you. It concerns a most dangerous man, a man who, if he ever suspected the existence of our band, would do his utmost to destroy it. That man is called the Shadow." Now, this is fascinating principally because it's not actually resolved within the pages of this particular novelette. It is then extended into the next story, which is literally named The Silent Seven. But what is kind of interesting is, as we review The Silent Seven, which is also an excellent story, this one is rated a little bit higher, I'll say this. I actually enjoyed The Silent Seven a little bit more than this one. They're both absolutely fantastic, the absolute tops of Shadow novels, but I love the second one for a lot of the... I mean, essentially, the idea is that there is a clandestine group, kind of like if the stonemasons or the Illuminati or something. It's got that kind of vibe. It's very wealthy and powerful, power brokers and so forth, a hidden secret society that sort of controls things from behind the scenes. And it's suggested they have some kind of political and financial power, and then gradually over time they give themselves over to crime. But we'll get more and more into that as we talk about the Silent Seven. Here, we simply allude to the Silent Seven. We learn that Dr. Palermo is a member of the Silent Seven, and that this Detective Warwick is actually a member of the Faithful 50, which are sort of their foot soldiers. Interestingly enough, the Faithful 50 don't play in that much into the Silent Seven novel, and arguably that is left a bit of a sort of hanging thread that is never quite addressed. But man, fascinating stuff, a great setup for the next novelette, and really not something that necessarily had to be resolved here. But guys, The Death Tower, wow, what a cool story. Definitely get it in the double novel reprints if you in any way possibly can. Walter Gibson, for his part, was interviewed years later and actually just said in relation to this story that his only regret is that he had the Shadow take the role of George Clarendon. And it seemed to make sense at the time. I mean, if you're writing, this does make sense because the way that George Clarendon takes a direct role and then winds up being suspected of certain things and the police wind up investigating him, it makes some sense that he wouldn't take the role of Lamont Cranston, even though essentially George Clarendon is like the Walmart brand of Lamont Cranston. And so it kind of makes sense George Clarendon would be taken here because his reputation is going to be sullied in the aftermath. And going forward, we need to sort of preserve the Lamont Cranston guys because the Shadow's obviously going to use that a lot more going forward. So I kind of get that. But yeah, the Death Tower. Guys, you need to go pick this up. It has been reprinted in the double novels, if you can find them, but it has also been reprinted in the old Bantam and Pyramid paperbacks, the old Yellow Pages paperbacks. So if you can find those, I highly recommend this one in the Shadow in Review book that you can get on Amazon by John Olson. I disagree with some of his takes in some of it, but basically he goes through every single Pulp story and reviews it. He gave this a perfect 5 out of 5, and I have to say I do not disagree with that. It is really good. This is, I believe, the first Shadow novel that actually drops the word count to the standard 60,000 words that we see going forward. This was a way of sort of reducing the workload for Walter B. Gibson because they decided to go monthly at this point. And actually, I think it just wound up making for better stories. There were some chapters, I would say, in the first several novels that didn't need to be there. Not so much the Red Menace. The Red Menace was perfect, as far as I'm concerned. But Gangnam's Doom, there were some chapters. Yeah, we could have cut out a few here and there. Could have cut out some of that exposition. Definitely, when I was reading Eyes of the Shadow, and especially The Shadow Laughs, I could see a few chapters being taken out. And in fact, when they wound up bringing those to paperback, those were heavily abridged. They actually took out some chapters that didn't need to be there. They performed some editing and so forth. So clearly there was some fat in those stories, and this dropping down, paring down the word count, I think really helps for these stories to move a little bit quicker. Guys, The Death Tower. Pick it up. It's one of the greatest in this initial 10-issue run of the first 10 Shadow stories. Before closing here, I really want to thank you guys. On my other channel, I did a video called Reject Modernity and Embrace Pulp Heroism, and I really didn't expect much from it. In fact, the first couple of hours it was up and only had a few thousand views. I figured, this is something I'm passionate about. It won't really matter if it gets any views or, attracts all that much attention. I really just want to get it out there because sometimes I find when I'm thinking of doing a video and I think, nobody's really going to be interested in it, other people might shy away from doing it or whatever. I always feel like if something has to be said, I do need to record it then and there because I need to be on the record as sort of having said it, if that makes sense. Because otherwise, other people will come along, take your idea, and steal the credit for it. You know what I mean? So I felt like it had to go out there, and then it wound up blowing up. There was a whole write-out about it on Bounding Into Comics, which I want to thank them for actually having done that. And it picked up a lot of steam. I even saw some comic creators like Ethan Van Sciver and such talk about it. So that was really humbling. I really appreciate that. But regardless, in that I talked about the Shadow, I talked about the importance of these pulp stories, and I hope you guys, as you're following along with me here, if we have any, I know we've gotten quite a few new listeners as a result of that video. I don't advertise much on my main channel, by the way, the Shadowcast. I feel like this needs to be a separate thing. You may notice I have a totally different delivery here. I try not to swear if at all possible. It's not like I'm sitting here trying to be Mother Goose. Truth be told, I don't swear very much in daily life. I more or less play a character on my channel. In daily life, I'm a bit of a monk. But I did want to say that because I know I've got a lot of new listeners, and I feel really passionately about that. Like, I'm really sort of taken aback at how people... I think I kind of sense the zeitgeist anyways. Like, if I feel it, I know there's got to be somebody else out there who feels it. That modern heroes are not doing it. They're not... The Shadow works because he's an uncompromising avenger of evil. That's one of the reasons the Simon Spurrier reboot from 2017 doesn't work. is because he's a morally compromising avenger of gray morality, debatable morality. It's like, it doesn't work. It's not the Shadow. And Condé Nast can try and reboot it. They can get James Patterson to do it. They can hire Stephen King to reboot the Shadow and promote the crap out of it. It could sell hundreds, thousands of copies. It doesn't matter. It still won't be the Shadow. It won't matter. The James Patterson novel, incidentally, went up like a fart in church, so I don't know that we're going to get a second one of those. Let's keep our fingers crossed. Who knows? But the Shadow knows. But seriously, I don't really see that as working. I think the Shadow is better and has more resonance the more you stick him in his appropriate context. It's just like Batman that way. You know, the closer to the root of the Batman concept you get, the stronger the resonances get to the present day. It's people can actually recognize context if you don't patronize them. And this is a problem with trying to update the character to the modern day, whether literally setting him in the modern day or trying to apply contemporaneous politics or ideas or social discourse or whatever to him. I think the best way for the Shadow to be, and I've learned this as I've read over the stories, read the comics and whatever, this has become clear as crystal to me. The best way for the Shadow to exist and the best way for him to achieve the most mass appeal is actually to put him directly into the specific time period in which he originally subsisted. Because we're always going to relate in some way to the travails that people were going through in the 1930s and all of that. I feel that way anyways. You feel free in the comment section to tell me like what resonates with you about the Shadow. Because to me, and we're heading into a bit of a, I won't get into like politics or economics or anything, but obviously there's been a bit of a economic downturn that's happening. Economists right now, as we speak, are debating whether or not it's going to be a lengthy recession or perhaps even a depression. Whether we'll call it a depression or not is kind of in the eye of the beholder. It seems like sometimes economists call it that, sometimes they don't. But, you know, if you can't see how the Shadow would fit into that environment, the Shadow really was... He was a proper sort of answer to the struggles morally, and it's kind of an answer and a bit of a panacea for the fears of the populace during the 1930s. He pops up right at the heart of Prohibition. Al Capone is rampaging in the streets. We already talked about Gangnam's Doom. I mean, how much more on the nose can you get than in the fifth Shadow story? The Shadow literally brings in the Chicago mob, headed up by a guy who is obviously meant to be Al Capone. It's obvious that the Shadow existed to sort of address our national anxieties in a lot of ways. We wanted to see these people brought to justice. We wanted to know that there was somebody out in the streets fighting for us. And so there was sort of this pulp icon that comes out of nowhere and sort of, he facilitates that need. Superheroes once did that. I don't think they are anymore. I really don't. As they've gotten more and more gray, I feel like they've become a situation where they're actually compounding our national anxieties, I think, in a lot of ways. They're actually creating more divides than they are bridging them. And the Shadow didn't do that. That's why he became such a multimedia phenomenon. I talked in my video a little bit about some of the staggering ratings figures for the Shadow Radio and the staggering buyership figures for the Shadow. I don't remember the exact circulation of the Shadow magazine, but as I was reading over, I actually finished Walter B. Gibson's biography recently. It's called Walter B. Gibson and The Shadow. It's by a guy named Schimmel, I think. And it was okay, a little dry, to be honest. Probably the best part of it was that he actually talked about particular diary entries. He had access, it was clear he had access to the private diaries of Walter B. Gibson. And Walter B. Gibson was a voracious proponent of journaling. He believed really strongly in it. He actually had his own methodology about journaling. Actually fascinating right now. I guess in this second part here, I'll talk about that particular biography, because I do recommend it on this basis, because Walter Gibson was really detailed in some ways and really ambiguous in others. But it was fascinating. He would catalog, if he took a trip, for example, he would make a mental note of how long the trip took. he would make a mental note of when the train showed up and things like that. Exactly what the weather was, exactly what time it was, exactly what had just occurred. So he had this really bizarre, you could see how only Walter B. Gibson's mind could have conceived of the Shadow, because it's sort of a mystery writer's mind, a guy who takes stock of every little detail. And when you, even reading just little excerpts of his diary entries, you can see, like, this was not just a normal dude. This guy was an exceptional intellect, and he observed things that a lot of people really didn't. In fact, I found it fascinating. There was a diary entry that he had made in, I think it was 1914. So he's pretty young at this point. And he was talking about how, why does it have to be that the hero is just this absolute doofus in stories? Like, he's just this gap-toothed, square-jawed tool. Why are we supposed to root for this guy when the villain gets to do all the cool things? There's no encumbrances on him morally or whatever. He dresses cooler, and he has a cooler weapon often. He has, a whole network of villainous agents and so forth. And he's like, and then the hero comes in at the 11th hour, and whether usually through dumb luck or a Deus Ex Machina or a plot device or something, he winds up winning the day, and we're supposed to clap and cheer. He's like, I remember this quote, "I must confess having a weakness for the villain, but I doubt that in the very near future, my ambition will be fulfilled." He wrote that in the 19-teens, guys, 2 decades before he winds up making The Shadow. Once you understand that, you really get where the Shadow's actually coming from. It's a fascinating book, actually. It's his early childhood stuff, I don't feel is well documented enough to justify how many chapters are spent on it. Also, they call the book Walter B. Gibson and The Shadow, and yet of all the chapters in the book, there's only 2 that relate to the Shadow. Mind you can see how the Shadow comes to be as a result of the chapters, especially on the American Society of Magicians, or whatever the name of that was, that he was involved with Harry Houdini, and how he became the biographer for Houdini. I didn't realize what an incredible force Blackstone the Magician had been in Walter B. Gibson's life. I found that all fascinating. Blackstone seemed like a stand-up guy. One of the most affecting chapters of that biography was when they talked about how his marriage had ended, and he really wanted to make it work. Walter B. Gibson, like a lot of creative sorts, was very much a guy who was off in his own world, and he was writing so heavily for The Shadow and for comics and whatever. You can imagine the price his personal life must have paid. So he had several marriages. I believe he had 3 over the course of his life, and his second wife left him. She just left out of the blue. There's no duplicity or anything. She just couldn't take it anymore, and he wasn't really recognizing the personal toll that it had taken on her. And so she splits, and Walter Gibson is absolutely distraught. He's shattered, and it's no exaggeration to say, he was near suicidal. And Blackstone the Magician comes in right then. He senses, he just could tell from letters and hearing from people that Walter was deeply, deeply depressed and living on his own in New York, all by himself in this empty apartment. And it's at that moment Blackstone the Magician comes in and says, "Hey, would you like to go on tour with me?" And it was the perfect thing. Walter was like, at the beginning, he had been writing to some of his friends and some of his relatives, I think even to his son or cousin, or nephew rather. And he'd been writing to them. At the beginning of that trip, he still sounded sort of despondent or whatever. He gets more letters like a month later, and Walter is like energized. And he's Walter B. Gibson again, right? I believe it's his son who says, it's no exaggeration to say, "Harry, really, Blackstone the Magician saved Walter B. Gibson's life." On that. That was a fascinating chapter, actually. Some of those more personal details are great. I haven't heard any of those stories in any of the other Walter Gibson biographies, but it's fascinating. There's some great little anecdotes. I forget what exactly it was in relation to, but I think it had something to do with opening a magic shop, possibly. And Walter Gibson was going to open a magic shop or something like that in the Philadelphia area. And so there were 2 rival newspapers in Philadelphia. And he shops the he approached the main newspaper, Philadelphia newspaper. I forget what it was, the Examiner or whatever. And he approaches them and says, hey, would you like to do a write-up on magic and me opening my magic shop and whatever? Because Walter Gibson had already been a newspaper print journalist at this point, so he's got some connections. Hey, would you like to talk about this new shop I'm going to open? I could do some magic demonstrations, talk about magic tricks, whatever, my history with some other famous magicians or whatever. And the paper said, nah, we're not gonna, unless, of course, you want to grease our palms, you want to pay us or whatever. Again, I'm kind of reciting this from memory. I can't remember if it was about a magic shop or about something else, so this could be incorrect, this first part here. But what is fascinating is they kind of turn him down, and he decides not to pay them. So instead, what Walter Gibson does is he goes to the rival newspaper, and he goes to them and he says, hey, how would you like a story about how your rival newspaper, who you hate, is charging people for articles about their magic shops and stuff? So the rival newspaper, just to get one up on the main newspaper in Philadelphia, decides to run this expose basically on how they're essentially soliciting bribes for articles, and so Walter Gibson gets a bunch of free advertising out of it for his magic shop. I think that's what it was about. It was either about that or the Society of Magicians. Genius. I mean, pure Walter V. Gibson. Some of that stuff is absolutely awesome. I also found it fascinating that he had been asked about who should play the Shadow, and he said Ronald Reagan. Which, incidentally, young Ronald Reagan, not that ridiculous of a choice, incidentally. He had said it years before that, so this wasn't like some loony concept. He did joke about it, in the 80s, just a few years before his death. It was like 84, actually, like a year before Walter Gibson's death. He said, I thought Ronald Ray, there's one guy who I would like to play the Shadow, but he won't be available till 1988. And then he sort of laughed. Obviously that was tongue-in-cheek. But he had said for many years that he thought Ronald Reagan was the perfect combination because he had done, if you remember, he got the name Gipper from doing a football movie. So there was a physicality to Ronald Reagan, so he could do the action, but he was also a dapper guy. You could see Ronald Reagan, he wound up being the president for crying out loud. You could see him as being a dapper man about town. So I found that really fascinating, actually. He was dead serious about that. He genuinely thought that Ronald Reagan would make the ideal shadow actor. And when you think about it, in his prime, if we're talking about if they were going to make a movie in the 40s or the 50s, yeah, I could totally see Ronald Reagan being the guy. So yeah, I read through that. I had a blast with it. I did find some of the chapters a little bit starchy, a little bit staid. Sometimes it didn't feel like he got that close to the man, Walter B. Gibson, but when you got a few of those little flashes of moments that you really got a sense of the man, Walter B. Gibson, like the fact that he really did not understand what he meant to pop culture. Like even at the end, he didn't quite get it. And he was also really frustrated because, for those who don't know, the 1994 Shadow film had been in development hell for years. They had been talking about it since the 70s. And he was, despondent about the fact that it had not been made. He was so frustrated. One of his final diary entries, he was like, I'm probably going to die before this movie comes out. And sadly, that wound up being a prophecy. Really, really sad. But a great book, I have to say, on balance. It's not perfect. It's a little bit slow in places, and I think they maybe add a little bit of biographical detail that isn't that interesting. There's also a bit of an awkward tendency from the author to not set things entirely in chronological order. It jumps around a bit, and one wonders if what happened there is that the author, Thomas Schimeld is his name, if the author didn't have access to a bunch of different diaries. Like, I think Walter Gibson kept several different diaries relating to different topics. Like, he had a magic journal, he had a writing journal, he had his actual just daily diary. And if he wasn't skipping around from source to source, having like jotted down notes when he had access to the diaries or whatever, and consequently wound up writing it all out of order, that suggests he maybe should have gone back and like revised some of it. But that's just a guess. But yeah, it's a little bit disjointed and kind of off-putting in places where you're 1 minute you're in 1932 and the next minute you're in 1914. It's like, whoa, what happened there? And then it jumps back to 1932. Really, really weird. But, he was a bit of a child prodigy. He had his first like puzzles published in newspapers at the very, very beginning of the 20th century at a very young age. Just an American treasure. You really do get a sense of like what this guy meant to pop culture, and sadly that he kind of died not really knowing exactly what he meant. He fought tooth and nail to try and get the rights to The Shadow. He felt that he was the creator. And there have been cases, copyright cases over the years, where the original creator has wound up suing for the rights to a character and has gotten them. So there was actually a good chance that Walter Gibson, because the whole thing he wanted to do was reprint all the novels. If you've ever wondered why Doc Savage got a bunch of novels long after Lester Dent had died, and even continuing to the present day, they're still publishing Doc Savage novels. If you're wondering why that happened with him, but The Shadow, who's much more popular, for some reason didn't get a bunch more novels, they stopped at a certain point, it's because Walter Gibson started hitting up Condé Nast. Hey, I want to be able to reprint these. I'm the creator. I want the rights to this. And there was a long, long legal battle between Condé Nast and Walter Gibson. And sadly, they only found out after his death, I believe. They tried to acquire, or maybe just prior to his death, his son or somebody else tried to get the rights to The Shadow for something. I forget what exactly it was for. And discovered to their dismay that Walter Gibson, at some point where he was hurting for money, had settled that case out of court for like $20,000, not even for that much of a sum. And so he basically signed his creator rights away to Condé Nast for that reason. For a long time, he didn't get any residuals from The Shadow. Condé Nast, to their credit, I gained some respect for Condé Nast, learning that actually Condé Nast, to this day, anything The Shadow, the estate of Walter Gibson, his relatives or whatever, they get a certain portion. I think it's like 50-50 or something of the actual credit for that, financial, royalties or whatever. They actually make that. That's one of the reasons the Pulp reprints were never, Condé Nast didn't get rich off of it. We talked about it before because they were actually splitting the funds with the Walter Gibson estate. I thought that was decent of them, to be honest, and I gained some respect for them. And then lost it, remembering that they let James Patterson write that novel. But regardless, so that's Walter B. Gibson and The Shadow by Thomas Schimeld. Not perfect, maybe not quite enough shadow in it for something that literally has a giant The Shadow logo on it. I mean, it's literally the biggest logo on the cover, and there's a big picture of The Shadow behind the picture of Walter Gibson on it. But regardless, false advertising or no, there's some fascinating details about this heretofore somewhat mysterious fellow. You get a little closer, not perhaps as close as I would like, to the actual personal figure of Walter Gibson. Maybe what this could have used is some more interviews, possibly, from some people who knew him. Like, why didn't he reach out to, like, Jim Steranko and some other people who really were in the sort of inner circle of Walter Gibson? I don't know why that is. Maybe the guy just was working from different sources, but I still do recommend it if you want to know about Walter Gibson's life and his import in pop culture. Walter B. Gibson and The Shadow. So guys, there's your homework assignments. The Death Tower and Walter B. Gibson and The Shadow. I had a blast on this edition of the Shadowcast. Until next time.
As you sow evil, so shall you reap evil. Crime does not pay. The Shadow knows.